Thank you very much, Sir Cheng and Sir Doris, for today's Sunday Pūjā. Today, back with us is Brother Ananda Fong. His topic of sharing today is considering wholesome or unwholesome actions. Now we should invite Brother Ananda Fong to start today's talk. Over to you, Brother Ananda.
Thank you, Brother Terence. Now, today's talk, considering, the key aspect is considering. Many of us are confronted with different kinds of actions of body, speech, and mind on a daily basis. And it is up to us to consider whether to do this action or that action. And if you want to bring in the aspect of wholesome and unwholesome, some questions may arise. What do you mean by wholesome? And what do you mean by unwholesome actions? And this is the topic we will be dwelling into this morning. Primary quotations will be from two main suttas. But just to start off, whatever actions we do, it has bearing on whether we make merit or demerit. So punya or apunya. And in this particular sutta, the Punya Kriya Vatu Sutta from the Iti Buddhaka, the Buddha says, because there are these three grounds for making merit. What three? One should train in deeds of merit that yield long-lasting happiness. And clearly here indicated by the Buddha is that merits produce happiness in the later portions of this life and hereafter. And what are these three grounds for making merit? Well, the familiar Pali words which many Buddhists are familiar: Dana, Sila, and Bhavana. Dana meaning giving, Sila means virtue or morality, Bhavana, mental development or cultivation. So these are the three grounds for making merit. And by cultivating these three things, deeds yielding happiness, the wise man or the wise person is reborn in bliss in an untroubled, happy world. So it is to our benefit, not just on the mundane side, but even our journey along the Noble Eightfold Path towards attaining liberation. Another aspect of making all these merits, implications of actions we do, the Buddha in yet Ananda Sutta from the Anguttara Nikaya, Book of 5, he says, I'm the owner of my deeds or actions, heir to my deeds. Deeds are my womb, my relative, my refuge. I shall be the heir of whatever deeds I do, whether good or bad. So clearly, whatever you have done, you cannot push it to or blame somebody else. You are the one who did it, so you own those deeds. And you inherit those deeds. And why? Because at the end of your life, there's nothing else you can carry with you into the next world. Not even your Lamborghini, your bonds, your FDs, all the gold that you've accumulated during this life. You can't. The only thing you carry with you are the implications, the potentialities of your earlier deeds. So you inherit those deeds. You carry those deeds with you right through samsara, the cycle of birth and death. Deeds are my womb, the Buddha says. Why? Because deeds determine where you are born, whether in the lower realms, the suffering worlds, as humans again, in the Deva worlds, or higher. Of course, all these births in wherever destination are all temporary. We are born, we live a life, and we pass away from those realms. And these also determine who are your relatives, who are your parents, your father, mother, brother, sister, uncles, aunties, and maybe even friends further afield. And whether they are good relatives or antagonistic relatives to you. And of course, it determines your refuge. And what is a refuge? Refuge is something we run underneath or we seek so that we can be safe from the rain, from the sun, from danger, and so on. That's my refuge. But here, refuge also covers things like, well, you want to walk the path, Noble Eightfold Path, your refuge is in the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. And if your deeds are not so good, bad deeds, what happens? Opportunities along the path underneath the Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha become fewer. In fact, you create your own roadblocks or hindrances along this path. So you remove all these hindrances when you perform a lot of wholesome deeds. And the Buddha concludes here, I shall be the heir of whatever deeds I do, whether good or bad. And all these deeds make karmic energies. So how is karma made? Well, a lot of people got different ideas. But from the Buddha, in the Anguttara Nikaya Book of 6, the Buddha says, intention, I tell you, is karma. Karma also means action. Intending, one does an action or karma by way of body, speech, and mind. So we must constantly remember that actions are motivated by our intentions. They motivate our bodily actions, our speaking actions, and what we think. Now, moving to the first sutta for this morning, the Amba Balitika Rahulovada Sutta from the Majjhima Nikaya, Sutta number 61. And the key top title is, how does one check on the deeds of body, speech, and mind? Now, what do you mean by that? Well, checking on whether that they are wholesome or unwholesome, which is the primary topic of today. How do we consider them, that they are wholesome or unwholesome, and whether we should do them or practice them or not? And many suttas, or rather majority of suttas, start with this famous Pali term recited by Venerable Ānanda in the first Sanghayana, first Buddhist council, because he heard the Buddha teach this particular sutta. So Venerable Ananda will start the sutta by saying, Evang me sutang. So I have heard, or thus have I heard. And Venerable Ananda provides the background. At one time, the Buddha was staying near Rajagaha, the capital of the Magadha country, a very big and powerful country, in the bamboo grove. Here it's underlined, bamboo grove, and the Pali word Veluvane. Now, Velu meaning bamboo, Vane or Vana means grove, like a park or taman, bamboo grove, the squirrel's feeding ground. Now, at that time, Venerable Rahula was staying at Amba Balitika. Now, the bottom right picture shows an incident before Rahula, the Prince Siddhartha's son, had renounced the world and became Venerable Rahula. Here, in this bottom right picture, it shows at the balcony of the palace at Kapilavatthu, the capital of the Sakyan country, the Buddha had been and his entourage had been invited by Prince Siddhartha's father, King Sudodana, to come back to Kapilavatthu for a visit. And at this balcony, the lady next to the young child is of course Rahula, and the lady is the mother, the child's mother, Yasodhara, looking down at the Buddha coming back with the entourage of the Sangha. At a later date, at the request or suggestion of the mother, Yasodhara, that the son, Rahula, go to the Buddha and ask him for his inheritance. And of course, the child dutifully came up to the Buddha and asked for his inheritance. Of course, the Buddha doesn't think like Prince Siddhartha. If it was Prince Siddhartha, his inheritance would be the kingdom of Sakya. But since Rahula was talking to the Buddha, and Buddhas think like Buddhas, the Buddha would say, my inheritance would be basically some aspects of the Dhamma. And with that, the Buddha proceeded to ordain Rahula, and Rahula, the young boy, became Venerable Rahula, although at that age, he was only a novice. So Venerable Rahula was ordained and entered the Sangha. And from then on, the Buddha and many of the leading disciples of the Buddha would take turns to help to teach Venerable Rahula in aspects of the training along the Noble Eightfold Path. And we come back to this particular sutta, Amba Balitika Rahulovada Sutta. Amba Balitika being the place where Venerable Rahula was staying at the time. And Rahulovada, we're talking about the teaching given by the Buddha to Venerable Rahula. Now, then in the late afternoon, the Buddha came out of retreat and went to Amba Balitika to see Venerable Rahula. Now, Rahula, the Buddha's son, who, according to the commentary, was at the time 7 years old when this discourse was delivered to him. That means it was basically the early days when young Rahula was ordained and became Venerable Rahula. What do you think, Rahula? What is the purpose of a mirror? The Buddha would say. And Rahula replied, it's for checking your reflection, sir. In the same way, deeds of body, speech, and mind should be done only after repeated checking or repeated consideration. And the Pali word, pacha vekitva, repeated twice, and kayena, meaning body, vachaya, meaning speech, and manasa, meaning mind. Here, the translation of the particular Pali word in this particular sentence gives the range of meaning. Having reflected, having considered, having reviewed, having contemplated. It means we think about it, we consider, and so on. So we reflect on these aspects, deeds of body, speech, and mind. And the Buddha says, should be done only after repeated checking, repeated reflection, contemplation, reviewing, and consideration. And here, the Buddha proceeds to give the range of actions that Venerable Rahula should use in training his or her action. Now, note that the Buddha is talking to a 7-year-old boy. And of course, for us, we should find no difficulty in understanding this aspect because the young boy range of understanding will be limited at that age. And of course, we should be able to understand the teaching of the Buddha being very simplistic. So here the Buddha says, when you want to act with the body. So when, it means before you perform an action. When you want to act with the body, you should check on the same deed. In this case, same deed that you are considering putting it into action. And we should ask ourselves, does this act with the body that I want to do lead to hurting myself, hurting others, or hurting both? So 3 aspects. A lot of people, when they perform actions, they don't really consider whether it hurts others. Of course, they are only concerned about, oh, this action should not hurt myself, and they don't care about others. But here's the Buddha's consideration is that any action that we review or reflect upon should not hurt yourself, should not hurt others, and should not hurt both. So we should ask another question. Is it unskillful with suffering as its outcome and result? Notice I underlined the word unskillful. The Buddha doesn't use the word good or bad actions. The Buddha used the word unskillful. And the Pali word is akusala. Okay. And suffering, dukkha is mentioned, is underlined also. So suffering as its outcome. So when actions are unskillful, suffering is expected to be its outcome and its result. If while checking in this way, you know this act with the body that I want to do leads to hurting myself, hurting others, and hurting both, it's unskillful with suffering as its outcome. To best of your ability, Rahula, you should not do such a deed. So clearly it's quite commonsensical that if it's hurtful to both parties, to yourself, to others, or to both, that we should not proceed performing those actions. But if you are checking in this way, you know that this act with the body that I want to do doesn't lead to hurting myself, doesn't lead to hurting others, doesn't lead to hurting both parties. It's skillful, and here is underlined in Pali, kusala. So when the action is wholesome, skillful, it's kusala, with happiness as its outcome and result. So clearly, skillful actions give rise to happy outcomes and happy results. Then Rahula, you should do such a deed. Now, that was before you perform those actions. And here we move on to the next stage. While you are acting with the body, you should check on that same act. Does this act with the body that I'm doing lead to hurting myself, hurting others, or hurting both? Is it unskillful with suffering as its outcome and result? If while checking in this way, you know this act with the body that I'm doing leads to hurting myself, hurting others, or hurting both, is unskillful with suffering as its outcome, then Rahula, you should desist from such a deed. So that means even while you are performing the actions, okay, and then during that performance, you review again and you found out that it is hurtful, okay, it is unskillful, then you should immediately stop performing those deeds. But if while checking in this way, you know this act with the body that I'm doing doesn't lead to hurting myself, hurting others, or hurting both, it's skillful, Kusala, with happiness as its outcome and result, then Rahula, you should continue doing such a deed. Now, the earlier two iterations was before you do, while you're doing, and now we move to after you have acted. So after you have acted with the body, you should check on that same act. Does this act with the body that I've done lead to hurting myself, hurting others, or hurting both? Is it unskillful with suffering as its outcome and result? If while checking in this way, you know this act with the body that I have done leads to hurting myself, hurting others, or hurting both, it's unskillful with suffering as its outcome and result, then Rahula, you should confess, reveal, and clarify such a deed to the teacher or a sensible spiritual companion. Now, this portion needs a little bit of explanation. Now, at that time, young Rahula was not an ordinary boy. He was a renunciant. He was a venerable Rahula. And venerables, whether as a novice or even as a monk in training or a monk who has obtained the higher ordination, the monk still has a teacher, a assigned teacher, okay, often called a preceptor. So what happens if you reveal that you have done something unwholesome? This is after you have done it, you should confess. That means you should reveal this, what they call unskillful actions to your teacher. And of course, if the teacher is not available, not physically available, then you should reveal it to a spiritual companion. And who is a spiritual companion? The fellow monastic. Now, you will also understand that elsewhere in other talks, that in Opposata, that means at least twice a month, new moon and full moon days, the Sangha are supposed to recite the Patimokkha, the 227 precepts, and so on. Also, in that session, there are opportunities for the monastics to reveal and confess their unskillful actions. That means non-observance of the 227 precepts and so on, some mystics, to their teacher or to their spiritual companion. That means another fellow monastic. You reveal, you do not keep it quiet. But after you reveal it, the next sentence by the Buddha is important. Then, having revealed it, you should restrain yourself in future. So this is the way. So it doesn't mean that you make a mistake, there will be punishment, send you to the dungeon or something like that. No, it's only in very, very serious, very, very impactful actions. Thereby, the Sangha as a community must, mete out actions or punishments to the monastic. But most of the time, in observance of the 227 precepts, you just have to reveal and confess it to your teacher and or spiritual companion. And then, after that, you are promising to another monastic that you will restrain, you will practice harder, okay, to stop performing those unskillful actions in the future. So, but if while checking in this way, you know this act of the body that I've done doesn't lead to hurting myself, hurting others, or hurting both, it's skillful or kusala, with happiness as its outcome and result, then Rahula, you should live in rapture and joy because of this. So live in rapture and joy. It means you should be happy that you have gone through this process, and you should rejoice. And then continue training day and night in skillful qualities. Now that was for actions by body. And here we move on to the next, speech. And it goes through the same process, the 3 steps: before, during, and after. So here, when you want to act with speech, it means when you want to speak, you should check on the same deed. Does this act of speech that I want to do lead to hurting myself, hurting others, or hurting both? If while checking in this way, you know this act of speech that I've done leads to hurting myself, hurting others, or hurting both, is unskillful, with suffering as its outcome, then Rahula, you should confess and reveal, clarify, and so on. This bottom portion is more for after you have spoken. So the earlier top of this page is before you act, you should consider and stop from speaking. So if the speech that has been done is skillful, with happiness as its outcome and result, you should live in rapture and joy because of this, training day and night in skillful qualities. And as mentioned, the earlier section was more on before doing, and of course here is while you're doing, you should review, and after you have acted with the speech, you should also check on the same deed. Same thing with the mind. So when you want to act with the mind, I mean before you think a certain thought, you should check on the same deed. Does this act of mind that I want to do lead to hurting myself, hurting others, or hurting both? And so on. Now, if while checking in this way, you know that this act of mind, in this case, that you have already thought about it, I have done, leads to hurting myself, hurting others, and hurting both, then it's unskillful, with suffering as its outcome, then Rahula, you should be horrified, repelled, and disgusted by that deed. And after being repelled, you should restrain yourself in future. But if while checking in this way, you know this act with the mind that I have done doesn't lead to hurting myself, hurting others, or hurting both, it's skillful with happiness as its outcome result, then Rahula, you should live in rapture and joy because of this, training day and night in skillful qualities. And of course, while you want to act with the mind, and after you have acted with the mind, you should check the same deed. So the before, during, and after for body, before, during, and after with speech, before, during, and after with the mind. This was the training regime the Buddha advised Venerable Rahula. Now here towards the end of the sutta, the Buddha says, all the ascetics and Brahmins of the past, future, and present who purify their physical, verbal, and mental actions do so after repeated checking. So Rahula, you should train yourself like this. I will purify my physical or bodily, verbal, and mental actions after repeated checking. That is what the Buddha said. Satisfied, Venerable Rahula was happy with what the Buddha said. And of course, Venerable Rahula proceeded to practice this. So this was how Rahula was instructed by the Buddha. And other times, of course, Venerable Sariputta will come by and advise Venerable Rahula on how to practice and so on. So there are a number of suttas which senior monastics would advise Rahula on how to practice. Now, cultivation. Now, aspects of sila, of moral training or virtues. For lay people, most of us are expected to take up the training precepts, the 5 training precepts. As Buddhists would know, there are no commandments in Buddhism. There are only training precepts. So we have recited earlier in the puja, Panati Pata Veramani Sikkhapadang Samadhyami. The key word there in that first line, the first precept, is that of Sikkhapada, the training path, the training precept. So since there are no commandments, there are only training precepts. So the Buddha encourages us to practice it. If we don't, well, the Buddha doesn't send us to hell or anything like that. It is just actions have consequences. So we proceed to continue killing. Of course, we bear the responsibility for that. And so these 5 training precepts, Panchasila, contains abstention from killing living beings, abstention from taking what is not given or stealing, abstention from sexual misconduct, abstention from false speech or lying, abstention from taking intoxicants or any substance that causes heedlessness. So this is the 5 training precepts which lay disciples are expected to practice. Now, a feature about the 5 training precepts are that they are protective, because when we conscientiously try to practice these precepts by not hurting other living beings and so on, we do not make unwholesome or unskillful karmic energies, which of course, if we don't make them, there will be no unpleasantness coming back to us at a later time. The results will not be unpleasant. But just because we are abstaining from all this list of 5, it doesn't mean that we are very, very pure. So we have to take positive actions to do something positive. And that's where the 5 ennoblers come in, which are the direct opposite. These are also training precepts, but it is different from the abstention aspect. Ennoblers means something positive. If we practice these 5, it makes us more noble as far as laity is concerned. So what are the 5 ennoblers? Well, the direct opposite of the 5 precepts. So the 5 precepts talk about abstention from killing. A nobler version would be we try to save lives. Of course, a common excuse, many lay people say that, oh, I'm not a doctor, I'm not in the medical profession. How can I save life? Well, first is we avoid killing living beings. So how to save them? Well, we learn certain skills and we watch out for opportunities to save lives. And we perform certain actions that prevent those lives from being lost inadvertently. A simple thing like if we clean our dining table after dinner, we will ensure that there are no ants coming overnight to eat up the scraps that we have left on our dirty dinner table. And then the next day when we wake up, we come to the table. So how are you going to clean? So we are left with the dilemma. And most people say, oh, because of my unskillful action the previous night, I have to use a wet cloth and wipe away the ants and kill those ants. So prevention is better than cure. So why don't we make sure after dinner we clean up the whole place and the ants will not come. And therefore the next day we don't have to kill the ants. That is prevention. But another aspect of the 5 ennoblers with respect to saving lives is learning skills. Skills like CPR, or when people have a heart attack, some aspect of it. So some simple first aid to save someone's life when we need to. Things like Heimlich maneuver, when people are suffocating because of some food they went and blocked their windpipe or trachea, and they can't breathe, and the simple Heimlich maneuver may dislodge that food particle from their top of the windpipe, and so they can continue breathing. Okay, so there are other things that we can also learn to perform in saving lives. That of donating blood, committing our bodily organs for donation when we no longer need them, and others. So there are opportunities, and that was a list with respect to saving lives only. If you go down the list, a list of 5, there are more we can think about. So we need to, while we are observing 5 precepts that protect us, we need to cultivate the 5 ennoblers so that we can make more wholesome merits that support us to make our lives in the future more pleasant. Now, in practicing the 5 precepts, there are certain things we have to consider also in its observance. And the next sutta, which is also one of the main suttas for this morning, here, the value Davaraya Sutta, the people of the bamboo gate. Remember the word Velu, V-E-L-U, again, like in the previous sutta, Velu means bamboo. So clearly, this was delivered in the Rajagaha area, famous for their bamboo. And this sutta is from the Samyutta Nikaya, sutta, chapter number 55, sutta number 7. Now, on the bottom right, I provide a brown box, Panatipata, which is the first of the 5 precepts, meaning destruction of life, killing living being. And how should we observe this precept? What are the things to consider when we practice the first precept? Now, a noble disciple reflects, I want to live. That means you yourself want to live and don't want to die. I want to be happy and recoil from pain. Since this is so, if someone were to take my life, I wouldn't like that. So far, it is very commonsensical. But others also want to live and don't want to die. They want to be happy and recoil from pain. So if I were to take the life of someone else, they wouldn't like it either. So this is the putting yourself in another's shoes, so to speak. And therefore, when we reflect thus, we also will refrain from such action. The thing that is disliked by me is also disliked by others. Since I dislike this thing, how can I inflict it on someone else? So these are the range of considerations we should ask ourselves and consider, reflect upon it, so that we practice the precept of avoiding destruction of life. But it goes further. Reflecting in this way, they give up killing living beings themselves. Okay, reflecting in this way, the practitioner of the 5 precepts give up killing living creatures themselves, which is obvious. But the next 2 may not be so obvious. Number 2, they encourage others to give up killing living creatures. So we go around encouraging others to also practice the first precept. And number 3, praising the giving up of killing living creatures. So we may see another practicing this, we should praise those actions of avoid giving up of killing living creatures. So their bodily behavior is purified in these 3 points or 3 aspects. So that they themselves give up killing, they encourage others to give up killing, they praise the action of giving up of killing living beings. So this is an important aspect of the first precept that we have to put into action. And here at the bottom of the page, the brown box, Adinadana, the second precept which we have recited earlier, taking what is not given, or more commonly called stealing. So a noble disciple reflects, if someone were to steal from me, I wouldn't like that. But if I were to steal from someone else, they wouldn't like it either. The thing that is disliked by me is also disliked by others. Since I dislike this thing, how can I inflict it on someone else? And reflecting in this way, they give up stealing themselves. So they don't steal other people's things. And they encourage others to give up stealing. And they praise the giving up of stealing. So their bodily behavior is purified in 3 points. So this is the further consideration in practicing the second precept of not stealing. Now moving on, we come to the third precept, Kamisu Micha. Now the word Micha, M-I-C-C-H-A, Micha means wrong or miss, something not appropriate. Cara, the C-A-R-A, is to do with conduct and action. So Micha Cara is wrong action or misconduct. So Kamesu is to do with the sexual aspect. So Kamusu Micha, sexual misconduct. Here, the noble disciple reflects, if someone will have sexual relations with my wives, I wouldn't like it. Of course, the plural here, wives, is reflective of the custom in India 2,600 years ago, where they can have many wives. But if I were to have sexual relations with someone else's wife, he wouldn't like it either. The thing that is disliked by me is also disliked by others. Since I dislike this thing, how can I inflict on others? So reflecting in this way, they give up sexual misconduct themselves. And they encourage others to give up sexual misconduct. And they praise the giving up of sexual misconduct. So their bodily behavior is purified in 3 points. So this aspect of Kamisu Micha talks about adultery. And we move to the 4th precept, Musavada, speaking falsehood, or in the short, lying. A noble disciple reflects, if someone were to distort my meaning by lying, I wouldn't like that. But if I were to distort someone else's meaning by lying, they wouldn't like it either. The thing that is disliked by me is also disliked by someone else. Since I dislike this, how can I inflict it on others? So reflecting in this way, they give up lying themselves. And number 2, and they encourage others to give up lying. And they praise the giving up of lying. So their verbal behavior is purified in 3 points. The picture on the bottom right clearly indicates the kid with a long nose, which most of us are familiar with this, what I call story. Now, that particular sutta goes on to talk about the other aspects of speech. That includes divisive speech, harsh speech, and gossiping or trivial talk, which I didn't reproduce here because we are concentrating on the 5 training precepts. But right through the Tipitaka, the recording of the Buddha's teachings, 45 years of teaching, you will see that a common refrain that the Buddha always asks us to refrain from unskillful actions and to cultivate wholesome actions. And here I extract from another sutta, one particular blessing, that if we are able to refrain from what is unwholesome and be steadfast in good qualities. And this is from the Mangala Sutta, the Sutta on blessing. Chinese will call it very ong, very good luck, very fortunate. So clearly, to refrain from what is unwholesome is fortunate for us because we don't make unwholesome energies. Unwholesome energies have a way of ripening or giving unpleasant results in the future. But be steadfast in good qualities, that means wholesome actions, in kusala actions. What happens? Be steadfast means not do wholesome actions for at one time only, but be steadfast means we learn how to do and we do it constantly, repeatedly. And we make more and more wholesome energies, which the result would be pleasantness. This is going back to the Iti Vudaka quote where I started this morning session, talking about merits giving us a lot more happiness in the future. And quoting from the Dhammapada too, should a person commit evil, let him not do it again and again. So in the Sumangala Sutta, the Buddha advises us not to perform unwholesome actions. And yet in another portion of the Tipitaka, in this case the Dhammapada verse 117, should a person commit evil, let him not do it again and again. Let him not find pleasure therein. For painful is the accumulation of evil. And the direct opposite, in Dhammapada verse 118, should a person do good, let him do it again and again. Let him find pleasure therein. For blissful is the accumulation of good. So clearly, I demonstrated by the sampling from various portions of the Sutta Pitaka or the Nikayas, the Buddha's repeated advice to the laity and even monastics. So that was my sharing this morning, considering wholesome, and hopefully we don't do any unwholesome actions. And this is my last slide, which summarizes the teaching of the Buddhas from Dhammapada verse 183. Sabba papasa akaranang kusalasa upasampada sacitta paryodapanang etang buddhana sasanam. That we should avoid all evil, do good, or in this case, do wholesome actions. Notice the Pali word, kusala again here. Purify your mind. This is the teaching of the Buddhas. So clearly, repeatedly, the Buddha exhorts us, appeals to us to do the sensible thing, that we should perform wholesome actions for a pleasant future. And of course, ultimately, purify your mind so that we can attain liberation from the round of samsara. Saddhammo cirang titatu. May the good doctrine long endure. Sabbe satta sukhi hontu. May all beings be happy. Thank you for your attention. Back to you, Brother Terence.
Thank you very much, Sister Ananda, for today's sharing. Now let's dedicate some marriage to all beings with a clear mind and a wholesome mind. Akasata cha bummata deva naga mahitika punyang tam anumoditva chiram rakantu loka sasanang ettavata cha amhehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe deva sabbe bhuta sabbe sattha numodantu sabba sampatti siddhya. Idang me nyati nang hotu sukita hontu nyatayo. Idang me nyati nang hotu sukita hontu nyatayo. Idang me nyati nang hotu sukita hontu nyatayo. The aspirations. Imina punya kammena mame bala samagamo satang samagamo hotu yava nibbana patiya. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Thank you everyone for watching. For other videos, please go to the links below. See you all next week. Bye bye for now.